Change my way of thinking, make myself a difference and a rule.
Right, good morning. Well, it's good morning to me. It could be good evening to you. This is the first of a series of talks I'm going to do on depression. It's not just going to be depression, it's going to be a series of wisdom talks, I suppose, on the heart, because as a practicing psychiatrist for over 30 years, my concern has always been to improve the quality of life at the heart level. What do I mean by the heart? I suppose I mean by the core of your being. It's not the thinking part of your mind. It's the experiential, intuitive part of your very being, which is experiencing life and enjoying life. And so, at the heart level, I'm really talking about joy, happiness, and the enemy of these things, which is depression. So in terms of the layout of how this is going to be, I'm hoping to keep the videos relatively short. I've only done 2 previous videos. One was 40 minutes long and one was 50 minutes long, and that's a bit long. So I've tried to keep these short. And so what I want to do is a whole series of videos, initially to introduce the topic of what is depression, and then maybe in future videos we will address why do we get depression, what causes it, how common is it, that kind of a thing, what to do about it, and the whole aspect of treatment, whether it's self-treatment or professional treatment. And there may be a whole load of other things we could do. We could cover spirituality and depression. We could talk about stress and depression, and lifestyle, and a whole load of things. So it could be fairly broad. I also thought, what's my audience? What am I aiming for? Well, I am a practicing Christian, so I am going to be bringing in kind of the spiritual life. As I've got older, I have got less and less religious and kind of less and less satisfied with what you might call corporate expression of, not corporate, institutional expression of spirituality. And I'm much more interested in personal experience and personal expression of spirituality. But we could talk about the traditions of the church, and in particular where that has let us down, because the traditional church has been pretty poor in certainly the last few hundred years. I mean, not right at the beginning, but certainly latterly, since the Middle Ages onwards, it's got worse and worse in addressing the interior life and the quality of interior life, and in particular acknowledging stuff to do with suffering and depression. So there'll be a whole lot of stuff we could address, but I'd like to just maybe today just talk about what depression is. Well, firstly, what isn't it? Well, it isn't a simple disease process. This has been recorded, right in the middle of the outbreak of coronavirus, COVID-19, and that is a single virus causing a single disease. But as a disease, the expression of it is in a series of variable symptoms. And this is where depression comes in. Depression does not have a single cause, so it's not a disease. It does have a huge variety of expression of symptoms. And so one person's experience of depression, and even objectively the way they present themselves, is going to be very different from somebody else, which is why it has been quite difficult to categorize it, to describe it, to delineate it from the point of view of a doctor, and to reliably therefore diagnose it, which is why the big challenge of depression is accurately picking it up and treating it effectively. And one of the tragedies is that there is such a high amount of depression that is untreated in normal life. And there are some reasons for that which are not to do with the expression of the disease. So that's the expression of it, but then the causes of it are absolutely multiple. There's many causes, both biological, both genetic, and also biological in terms of other illnesses, and brain damage. And then, of course, the effect of life trauma, life experience, culture, upbringing, all these things. These all tend to push us and predispose us towards depression if they've been far from ideal. And we will look at that. But at the moment, I really want to just focus down on what does depression look like? When we say depression, what do we mean? Well, let's start off with simply feeling low, feeling unhappy, feeling miserable, feeling negative. That is the essence of it. Now, we all kind of know that. It's just that we never seem to recognize it in ourselves and miss it in other people. So let's have a look at what the medical people tend to think of, and psychologists when they're diagnosing depression. Now, let's bear in mind that the definitions of depression are kind of arbitrary. They are constructs, and they may be driven in part by treatability, as in there's a paradox. The more severe the depression, the more likelihood is that particularly more biological treatments are going to work. That's an absolute rule of thumb, that things like antidepressants don't work very well when you're in the milder forms of depression. So a line is drawn between the normal experience of unhappiness all the way through to the severe experience of the most severe depression. And, you know, between you and me, depression, certainly in the early part of my career, before there were better antidepressants, was one of the most worrying illnesses to treat, because people could completely shut down. At its most severe end, depression means that you don't sleep, your thinking is completely disordered, and you don't move, maybe don't eat, and certainly the severe forms of depression, people used to just starve to death. They would just stop eating, stop moving, and neglect themselves so much that they wasted away. And there was quite a high mortality. Thank goodness we're outside of those times. So we've got this arbitrary line, and so when your GP diagnoses you with depression, what's the threshold that you have to reach? Well, normally you need to have some kind of experience of lowered mood or altered mood towards a negative end of the spectrum. Now, that can be feelings of sadness or unhappiness, but it also could be just pervasive irritability. And that mood needs to have lasted for at least 2 weeks or more. That's usually the line. So, you know, if something bad's happened and you've been upset for the last couple of days, you might be very low for a couple of days, but that's not considered to be depression. It's got to be more pervasive, long-lasting, and kind of unreactive. So you need a mood that isn't kind of up and down. So some people are unhappy in their lives, and they could be perhaps unhappy at work, but if they go on holiday or maybe they go to friends' houses for a social event, and their mood can be absolutely fine. There is a kind of proviso here, because people with depression can still rally, their mood can still rally for short periods of time, but your mood needs to be low for the majority of the time. I mean, speaking from kind of family experience, my father, I think, started to suffer from anxiety and depression in his 50s, but it was pretty work related. And so if he was at work, he was pretty pervasively irritable, panicky, anxious, and low in mood. But if he could, when he had a decent holiday break, he would be absolutely fine. And that gives us a bit of a clue as to what we should be doing. So mood needs to be altered, it needs to be lowered, and it needs to be fairly consistently low and relatively unreactive, though, as I've said, depression can still people with depression can rally for brief periods of time, particularly if they use substances like alcohol, which we will go into probably in detail in a later talk. But just because you go out and get, a few glasses of wine at some social event and then you can feel fine, doesn't mean that you're not depressed. That just means that you temporarily reacted to one of nature's antidepressants, which is alcohol. I know people talk about alcohol being a depressant, but it does have short-term antidepressant qualities, which is why people with depression can fall into alcohol addiction. So we've defined one of the components of depression to be lowered mood. Now, I just want to remind you again, I've sort of alluded to it already, but there can be different types of mood. Women and men tend to express depression slightly differently. Men tend to get more angry, and women tend to get more unhappy and low. And that is pretty common, that men will not express their depression in such an emotional way. They can be bad-tempered, they can get aggressive, they can start smashing things up. If they're young, they can get into fights, they can start to abuse alcohol and drugs more. And so in some parts of the Western world, depressed young men will present much more in things like criminal settings, police stations, etc., because they've got into fights. Women tend to be much more help-seeking in terms of going to doctors and professionals, though it's not an absolute rule. But it is one of the things that have led to a lot of research papers suggesting that twice as many women get depressed as men. I've always wrestled with that as a psychiatrist, because if you look at suicide, then 3 times as many men tend to kill themselves as women. And sometimes that ratio is higher than 3. It can be 4 or 5 times higher. And suicide is related to depression. So if you change some of the definitions of depression to include irritability and aggression, then the rates of diagnosis in men and women are about 1 to 1. So I think men and women do equally suffer from depression. That's something I've felt for a long time. So the expression of mood, it doesn't necessarily always have to be sadness. That's really, really important. It can be anger and aggression. But you need to think, well, what in the spectrum of mood, is this a low mood? Or, and there are lots of varieties of different low moods. So mood is the big component, but sometimes people do not present complaining specifically of low mood. That's not the thing they complain about. They can be complaining of what we call cognitive symptoms, as in the way your mind and brain works. And when you're depressed, your concentration can deteriorate, your decision-making, your memory, and sometimes people think that they're getting dementia, that they are struggling with a brain illness because they can't do their jobs. So cognitive symptoms are really, really important. So memory, concentration, I've mentioned, but also thinking style. It's absolutely a rule that our emotions and our thinking are linked. Now, whether you're a psychiatrist or a psychologist, people sometimes argue which comes first. Is it your thoughts or is it your feelings? But thoughts and feelings are linked. So if your mood is low, your thinking will be negative, and it'll be more negative, and it'll be more pervasively negative. I was reflecting this morning that unhappy people tend to see badness as being pervasive and permanent. So badness in the world, badness in your life is everywhere, and it's stable, it's not going to go away. And goodness, good things, good experiences are temporary, and they are specific. So, you don't generalize out the good things, they are specific. Whereas happy people see goodness everywhere. Goodness is pervasive, and goodness is permanent. Goodness is mostly everywhere. Whether you think of yourself as good or whether you think of others as good. and badness is not pervasive. It's specific, and so you might say, you know, a certain political leader is bad, but the entire party isn't bad, or the entire government isn't bad. You know, you'd be much more specific in your blame. I don't know why I picked those examples, and temporary. You know, well, things can get better. So your thinking style changes, and classically, if you're depressed, you will have what's called a depressive triad. You know, that's three things. It's not tripod, it's triad. And so you will be negative about yourself, critical, you know, condemning. You'll be negative about the world, and particularly at this time when there's a lot of critical stuff coming out about government and society and trade and immigration and the EU and COVID, and everything seems to be awful. But a depressed person will just see negative stuff. So it'd be negative about the self, it'd be negative about the world, and negative about the future. So you start to believe that nothing is going to ever improve or change. So your symptoms become that of mood and a change in thinking. And this is quite important. That depression is about change. You have changed from one state to another. It's slightly different if you can never remember ever having been happy. We need to talk about the role of temperament and personality and stuff in that. But it's where either you or someone else can say, you know, you've changed. You are different. You don't laugh anymore. You don't take any joy in things, and you're always irritable, and you're neglecting yourself, and you're very pessimistic. You know, somebody needs to be pointing it out, or you need to be pointing it out. I just had a conversation with a member of my family last night who expressed that they've realized that very gradually they slipped into over maybe a few years, slipped into a state of low mood and chronic anxiety, and they hadn't seen it coming. It's the classic story of you know, the frog being put into a pot of cold water and then doesn't hop out while the temperature of the water just gradually goes up and up and up. And depression is most commonly like that it just gradually and slowly builds until you eventually realize, actually, when was the last time I enjoyed myself? When was the last time I was happy? So low mood, change in thinking, and then another really important set of symptoms is what I always taught as biological symptoms, but you might just call them physical symptoms. And this is because depression isn't an illness which affects the end. The final common pathway of depression is it affects the way the brain works. And the part of the brain that we're talking about depression affecting is what's called the limbic system, which is, if you imagine the brain to be like an egg, then the bit that you think of as the brain, all that foldy bit that looks like a bunch of sausages, that's the computer of the brain, the cortex, the outside bit, and that's the bit that's to do with your more practical everyday functioning. But the inside of the brain, the egg of the brain, is the yolk of the egg, and that's the limbic system, and that's the bit that coordinates the integration of feelings, memory, and some of the biological patterns of sleep and appetite, and actually sex drive as well. And the limbic system is predominantly the bit of the brain that affects, that's affected by depression. So, the biological symptoms. So once we start getting quite markedly low in mood, then we experience a deterioration of sleep. And the classical sleeping pattern is that we wake up too early. So it's called early morning awakening. Though some people don't get this classical symptom of early morning awakening, they might get what's called, just an inability to fall asleep. So but either way, your sleep pattern becomes disturbed, it becomes lighter, often with more frequent dreaming or nightmares. And we are also then experiencing fatigue during the day, and often maybe having to fall asleep during the day as well if our sleep's really bad. But early morning awakening or sleep disturbances is absolutely classical. And then I'm feeling particularly low in mood first thing in the morning, with a sense of mood lifting a little bit as the day goes on. And I'm not talking about lifting to normal, but certainly an intense low mood in the morning. And that's called diurnal variation of mood, where the mood does have a bit of a pattern. Now, there's always huge numbers of people that don't get this classical pattern. Some people's mood is better in the morning and gets worse as the day goes on. And some people's mood is more pervasively lowered. But it is an interesting sign if you can get a variation in mood. So sleep gets disturbed. The pattern of mood is different. And then physical appetite for food goes right off, not interested in food. And usually people who are depressed eat less and lose weight. And then the other thing is, what was it I was going to say? Well, actually, let's go back to the appetite. There is an atypical form of depression where people will eat more, and they will eat more and maybe eat more compulsively, and they will put on weight. But that's rarer. It is much more common to lose your appetite, lose weight. You can other biological symptoms you can get constipation. The bowels seem to shut down, and really interesting. There's something that people with depression are often described as being rather dull in the eyes, and that's because the rate of tear production goes down. There's a lot of biological parameters which change when you're depressed. So you don't even make the same amount of tears coming out of your tear ducts, so your eyes aren't shiny. And it's absolutely true that when you're psychologically healthy, your eyes will be shiny. So depression affects us physically, and another predominant symptom is fatigue. So you have these three groups of symptoms: that of feelings, that of thinking, and that of the physical, I suppose. And I suppose then you have a huge amount of fatigue. People with depression have fatigue, but they often continue, even with the fatigue, they lack an ability to sleep properly, and they lose motivation, which is a really important thing, because without it we cease to function. And so usually with depression you notice that you can't carry out your normal routine, whether it's work or whether it's in the home, and if you have any sense of spirituality, that will be heavily impaired. So your sense, whatever your spirituality is, but let's say from a Christian perspective, you would feel maybe that heaven is now closed. You don't hear God. You don't feel there's any answer to prayer. You may even doubt that God loves you. You may feel you're being punished. So there's a huge dimension to the expression of spirituality. So as you can see, the whole spectrum of symptoms of depression is quite varied. Not everybody gets all these symptoms. It's quite rare that everybody will get all these symptoms. You might get more in one group. But overall, you need to certainly not be able to carry out your normal everyday activities and function correctly. And usually people can't work once they become seriously depressed. I want to finish this particular section with a reminder that it is slightly arbitrary, this as to whether somebody has a depressive illness, a medically diagnosed illness, or whether it's on the range of unhappiness. But I would say that the most important question you need to ask yourself is, am I my normal self? Or if you're a carer or a relative or a loved one of somebody who thinks suffering from depression, are they their normal selves? So the ability to do work, for example, I would not necessarily say means you haven't got depression. I've known plenty of people that manage to pull through and function just about at work, but are they doing it the same way as before? And the thing about depression is it is a descent, and you don't really want to keep on allowing yourself to get lower and lower and lower. Life is too short. So whilst this has not been the most inspiring beginning, I do think that we need to look to the next few talks for the answers. This is now just a description about depression. So hopefully that's been helpful to you, and I will see you at the next talk. Right, goodbye.
Change my way of thinking.